19 days. That's how long it took. 19 days after the final wall of concrete came down, a biologist standing in a creek in southern Oregon watched a female Chinook salmon turn sideways in 6 inches of water and start beating her tail against the gravel. She was digging a nest. She was laying eggs in water that no salmon alive had ever touched. Not because they forgot the way, because for over 100 years there was no way in. And what happened in the weeks and months after that single fish finished her nest is going to change how you think about every permanent wall humans have ever built. Whether it's made of concrete, or policy, or the quiet agreement that some things just can't be undone. Stay with me, because the number at the end of this story, the one about how many fish showed up a year later in places they'd never been, is going to make you rethink the word impossible completely. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what stood in that river for a century before you can understand what it meant when it disappeared. 4 dams, not one. 4, built between 1918 and the early 1960s, stacked one after another across a river that used to carry one of the largest salmon runs in the entire continental United States. The first one went up in 1918. It had no way for a fish to get past it. No ladder, no bypass, nothing. It simply stopped the river's entire population of salmon in its tracks, and then 3 more dams went up behind it over the following decades, sealing the door shut and then bricking over the door frame. For over 100 years, salmon that had swum from the Pacific Ocean, through hundreds of miles of river, arrived at that first wall and simply could not go any further. Generation after generation of fish, born to swim upstream, hitting concrete instead. Here's what most people don't understand about what a dam actually does to a river. And it's not just the blocking. It's the water itself. Behind each of those 4 dams sat a reservoir, a wide, slow, sun-exposed pool, where water that used to move now just sat there. And sitting water in direct sunlight does something specific. It heats up, it grows things. By summer, those reservoirs were warm enough and stagnant enough to breed toxic algae blooms, the kind that can kill pets, sicken people, and poison fish. And the salmon that did survive the journey, the ones that couldn't get past the final dam, were forced to crowd together in the same shrinking stretch of cold water below it, competing for space, spreading disease to each other in numbers that never would have happened in a free-flowing river. There's a parasite called sea shasta that thrives in exactly these conditions. Warm, slow, crowded water, and it was quietly killing young salmon by the millions before they ever reached the ocean. The dam wasn't just a wall. It was a slow-motion trap rigged to catch every fish that made it that far. And then in September of 2002, the trap sprung all at once. Low water, warm temperatures, overcrowding, disease, all of it converged in a matter of days. Tens of thousands of adult salmon, some estimates go as high as 70,000, died in the lower river, not out at sea, not before they made it home. They died within sight of the finish line, after swimming hundreds of miles, after surviving years in the ocean, after doing everything right. Their bodies lined the riverbanks for miles. For the tribal communities who had depended on this river for food, for ceremony, for identity, for literally thousands of years, this wasn't an ecological statistic. This was watching something they loved die in front of them, in a place it should have been safe. That die-off is the moment this story stops being about fish and starts being about people who refused to accept that the wall was permanent. A tribal member named Molly Myers saw those dead fish while she was raising young children. 2 years later, she was 6 months pregnant, and she got on a plane with about 25 other tribal representatives and flew to Scotland. Why Scotland? Because that's where the company that owned the dams was headquartered. They showed up outside a shareholder meeting. played drums, cooked salmon over an open fire right there on foreign soil, and forced a room full of executives thousands of miles from that river to explain why their decisions were killing a river basin they'd probably never seen. When the company that owned the dams eventually became part of Warren Buffett's empire, the protest didn't stop. It just moved. Tribal campaigners showed up before dawn at Buffett's own shareholder meeting to confront him directly. Molly Myers started this fight pregnant. Her children grew up during it. The dams didn't come down until those kids were adults. Think about that. An entire childhood, start to finish, inside one fight to remove 4 walls from a river. And there's a man you need to know about who didn't get to see how the story ended. A Yurok leader named Troy Fletcher spent roughly 20 years, 2 full decades, negotiating between tribes, farmers, fishermen, and governments who spent most of that time treating each other as enemies. He built the bridges. He did the impossible diplomatic work of getting people who hated each other's guts to sit at the same table. He died unexpectedly, nearly 10 years before the dams finally came down. His mother lived to watch the concrete disappear. Her son did not. That's the actual cost of this story. It's easy to talk about salmon and sediment and megawatts, but somewhere in there is a mother watching a river get freed that her son gave his life's work to and never got to see finished. So why did the company that owned these dams, a company with every financial incentive to keep them running, eventually agree to tear them all down? Here's the part that should make you angry. It wasn't environmental conscience. It was math. Keeping the dams running would have required expensive relicensing and modern fish passage upgrades to meet updated environmental standards. The company ran the numbers and realized it was cheaper to just take the dams down than to fix them properly. The final agreement landed somewhere between $450 and $500 million, funded through customer payments and state bonds. 4 generations of salmon died, so a company could avoid an upgrade bill, and it still took over 2 decades of relentless pressure before the math finally tipped in the river's favor. Now here's where it gets terrifying. Because tearing down 4 dams isn't like popping a cork. Behind those reservoirs sat over 15 million cubic yards of sediment. Fine, decades-old muck that had been quietly settling at the bottom since before some of our grandparents were born. Engineers knew that when they drained those reservoirs, a massive amount of that sediment was going to move downstream all at once. Critics warned it could suffocate the very fish the project was supposed to save. They warned about toxic material getting released, about property damage, about flooding, about destroying the river in the process of trying to save it. And when the drawdown actually happened in early 2024, the river turned the color of chocolate milk for miles. Fine sediment and decomposing material poured downstream in a flood of brown water, while biologists held their breath, watching oxygen levels in real time, terrified they were about to cause a second mass fish kill, this time on purpose, in the name of restoration. They didn't. Crews adjusted the releases carefully enough to avoid the oxygen collapse that would have turned this rescue mission into a repeat of 2002. And then, in September of 2024, the final cofferdam came down. The last physical barrier between the Pacific Ocean and hundreds of miles of upstream habitat simply ceased to exist. 5 days later, something showed up that nobody expected to be first. Not a salmon. A Pacific lamprey, an ancient jawless fish older than salmon in evolutionary terms and just as sacred to the tribes who'd fought for this moment. It swam straight into newly accessible water, like it had been waiting at the door the entire time. Then, 14 days after that, on October 15th, Biologists watched Chinook salmon occupying and spawning in a tributary more than 4 miles upstream of where the last dam used to stand. 19 days total. Fish that were born while the dam still existed, fish that had never once in their lives swum through an open Klamath River, found their way to spawning gravel that hadn't held a Chinook nest since before their great-grandparents were born. Less than 2 months after that, threatened coho salmon, a species scientists hadn't documented in that upper basin in over 60 years, showed up right behind them. And I want you to sit with that sequence for a second, because it destroys a specific kind of thinking. For 100 years, humans assumed the salmon had essentially forgotten this water existed, that generations of separation had erased it from their biological memory. They hadn't forgotten anything. They had never known. And they found it anyway, in weeks, using nothing but instinct and open water. The following year is where the story goes from remarkable to almost unbelievable. In 2025, officials documented salmon not just spawning near the old dam sites, but pushing more than 360 river miles inland, crossing an entire lake, passing through tributary systems in a neighboring state, showing up in cold spring complexes they had been locked out of since before automobiles existed. More than 13,000 fall-run Chinook were counted upstream of where the final dam used to sit, and in one single reopened creek, biologists counted approximately 65,000 wild juvenile salmon, 65,000 baby fish, born from parents who had only just discovered that water existed. That number is the real proof. Adults showing up as exploration. 65,000 wild juveniles is reproduction. It means the system is already working. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The part that goes beyond fish entirely. When a salmon spends years out in the ocean, it's building its entire body out of marine nutrients, out of the ocean itself. When that fish swims inland and dies after spawning, which they all do, its body doesn't just disappear. It feeds bears, it feeds eagles, it feeds insects and soil and the trees along the riverbank. For over a century, that entire nutrient pipeline into the upper basin was severed by 4 walls of concrete. Every salmon that dies upstream now is quite literally carrying a piece of the Pacific Ocean into a landscape that has been starving for it for generations. That's not a metaphor, that's biology, and it's only just started. There's also something happening above the waterline that almost gets lost in the fish story. Draining those reservoirs exposed over 2,000 acres of land that had been sitting underwater for decades. Land that includes places of deep ancestral and cultural significance to the tribes who lived there long before any dam existed. California has moved to return a portion of that exposed land, nearly 3,000 acres, to the tribal nation whose ancestral home it was. The water didn't just recede and reveal mud. It revealed a homeland that had been drowned on purpose for power generation, for a company's balance sheet. Now, before you assume this story wraps up in a perfect bow, it doesn't, and I won't pretend it does. Scientists who studied this project before it started estimated that establishing genuinely self-sustaining wild salmon populations in that upper basin could take 10 to 15 years, multiple full salmon generations, not 2 migration seasons. There's still at least one major dam further upstream that fish have to navigate. One with a fish ladder that wasn't built for the volume of traffic it's suddenly seeing. Some tagged salmon have already reached it and turned back. Warm tributaries, irrigation diversions, drought, and ocean conditions all still threaten this recovery. The wall coming down didn't fix everything. It just made everything else possible. And that's really the whole point of this story, isn't it? Humans spent more than 100 years believing this river's upper reaches simply didn't belong to salmon anymore. It took over 2 decades of protest, lawsuits, funerals, shareholder confrontations on 2 continents, and $500 million to finally prove that belief wrong. The lamprey needed 5 days to disagree. The Chinook needed 19. The salmon were never the ones who thought the wall was permanent. We were. If this is the kind of story that makes you look differently at the things we're told simply can't be undone, tell me in the comments which part hit you hardest: the fish kill, the flight to Scotland, or the 65,000 juveniles in a single creek. Because there's a lot more sitting right behind this one, and it goes even deeper than a river.